Tonight, the world feels unusually tense as global attention turns once again toward rising tensions between Iran and Israel, a situation that has rapidly evolved into one of the most closely watched geopolitical crises of our time. Because when two powerful nations move closer to confrontation, the consequences rarely remain limited to one region and instead begin influencing global stability, economic confidence, and international security within hours, as reports of heightened military readiness, strategic warnings, and defense system activations continue to emerge, signaling that this moment may represent far more than routine political disagreement, since modern conflicts rarely begin with official declarations and instead unfold through calculated signals understood primarily by military commanders and intelligence agencies. And for decades, Iran and Israel have existed in a state of indirect rivalry, fought through regional influence, cyber operations, strategic deterrence, and proxy tensions rather than direct warfare, creating what analysts often describe as a prolonged shadow conflict, where each action carries the risk of escalation. And today, experts warn that this fragile balance may be shifting as global markets react instantly, oil supply concerns grow, and world leaders initiate urgent diplomatic discussions behind closed doors, recognizing that instability in the Middle East affects international trade routes, energy prices, and political alliances across continents. While beyond strategy and power calculations lies the human reality of millions of civilians following breaking news with uncertainty and concern, hoping that diplomacy succeeds before confrontation becomes unavoidable. Because history repeatedly demonstrates that the most dangerous phase of any conflict is not open war itself, but the period of uncertainty when intentions remain unclear, responses unpredictable, and defensive preparations increase pressure on both sides, raising the possibility that misunderstanding or miscalculation could trigger rapid escalation. And as military forces remain alert and diplomatic channels continue operating under intense pressure, governments, analysts, and citizens around the world are now asking the same critical question: whether the current escalation represents strategic warning, political signaling, or the beginning of a conflict capable of reshaping regional and global security in the days ahead. As tensions continue to rise, the military reality behind the Iran and Israel confrontation becomes impossible to ignore, because both nations possess highly advanced defense capabilities developed over decades of strategic planning shaped by regional threats and national survival concerns. And while public statements often emphasize deterrence, experts understand that modern warfare no longer depends solely on ground invasions, but instead combines missile technology, cyber operations, intelligence, warfare, aerial defense systems, and rapid response strategies designed to control escalation while maintaining dominance, meaning that any direct confrontation would likely begin not with traditional troop movements, but with precision strikes targeting strategic infrastructure, communication systems, or military installations intended to send powerful political messages without immediately triggering full-scale war. Yet history shows that limited actions rarely remain limited for long, especially when national security perceptions are involved. As defense analysts closely monitor missile ranges, air defense readiness, naval deployments, and regional alliances, attempting to predict how quickly escalation could spread beyond bilateral confrontation into a wider regional crisis involving neighboring territories and strategic waterways critical to global energy transportation. Because even the perception of instability in this region can disrupt oil supply expectations, causing economic reactions across international markets within minutes, while global powers simultaneously evaluate their diplomatic positions, balancing calls for restraint with commitments to long-standing allies, creating a complex environment where every military movement is interpreted not only as defense, but also as signaling intention. And in such moments, communication becomes as important as capability, since misunderstanding between opposing forces increases the risk of unintended escalation, particularly when defensive preparations on one side appear offensive to the other, reinforcing cycles of suspicion that make de-escalation increasingly difficult, while civilians across the region continue daily life under growing uncertainty, aware that geopolitical decisions made far above them may determine security conditions overnight. And as intelligence assessments attempt to forecast potential scenarios ranging from controlled retaliation to prolonged confrontation, the central concern among international observers remains whether diplomatic intervention can outpace military momentum. Because once escalation crosses certain thresholds, political leaders often find fewer options available without appearing weak domestically or strategically vulnerable internationally, leaving the world watching carefully as events unfold in real time, wondering whether this crisis will stabilize through negotiation or evolve into a defining conflict that reshapes power dynamics across the Middle East and beyond. The Iran and Israel tensions continue to dominate global headlines. Attention increasingly shifts toward the role of major world powers whose strategic interests make this conflict far more than a regional dispute. Because any escalation between these two nations immediately draws concern from countries dependent on Middle Eastern stability for energy, security, trade routes, and geopolitical balance, prompting urgent diplomatic engagement aimed at preventing a crisis that could expand beyond control. Since modern conflicts rarely remain isolated and instead trigger chains of political and military reactions involving alliances, security commitments, and economic partnerships developed over decades, meaning that decisions taken in one region can rapidly influence defense strategies across Europe, Asia, and the wider international community. While analysts begin examining worst-case scenarios, including the possibility of multi-front instability that could disrupt global shipping lanes, increase energy prices, and intensify military readiness worldwide, raising fears among observers that prolonged confrontation might unintentionally create conditions resembling broader international conflict. Although experts emphasize that large-scale war is never inevitable and often avoided through calculated restraint and diplomatic pressure applied at critical moments. Yet the danger lies in escalation cycles, where retaliation leads to counter-retaliation, gradually narrowing opportunities for peaceful resolution, especially in an era where advanced missile systems, cyber capabilities, and real-time intelligence reduce reaction times and increase pressure on leadership decisions. As global financial markets respond cautiously, investors monitor uncertainty, and governments prepare contingency plans designed to stabilize economic systems should tensions worsen, while humanitarian organizations quietly assess potential civilian risks, understanding that even limited military exchanges can create displacement fear and long-term regional instability. And amid these developments, world leaders face a delicate challenge, balancing deterrence with diplomacy, attempting to prevent escalation without encouraging further aggression, leaving international observers questioning whether strategic dialogue can successfully reduce tensions before events move beyond political control. Because history repeatedly demonstrates that moments like these define future global order, not only through military outcomes, but through the choices leaders make under pressure. And as diplomatic conversations continue behind closed doors, alongside visible military preparedness, the world now confronts a defining uncertainty, wondering whether this crisis will ultimately become a turning point toward renewed negotiation or a dangerous step toward prolonged instability capable of reshaping international relations for years to come. As tensions between Iran and Israel continue to escalate, the economic consequences of uncertainty begin spreading far beyond the immediate region, demonstrating how modern geopolitical crises affect everyday life across the globe. Because the Middle East remains one of the most critical centers of global energy production, and even the possibility of conflict creates immediate reactions in oil markets, international trade systems, and financial institutions, causing fluctuations that influence fuel prices, transportation costs, manufacturing expenses, and ultimately household economies worldwide. While investors respond cautiously to instability, shifting capital towards safer assets, and governments quietly prepare economic contingency strategies designed to protect national markets from sudden disruption. Since prolonged tension near major shipping routes raises concerns about supply chain security, particularly through waterways essential for transporting energy resources to Asia, Europe, and other global markets, increasing fears that continued escalation could slow economic recovery efforts, already challenged by inflation and geopolitical competition. While businesses dependent on stable trade conditions monitor developments closely, understanding that uncertainty alone can reduce investment confidence and weaken economic growth projections. Yet beyond financial systems, the human cost becomes increasingly visible as civilians living within affected regions experience psychological stress, disrupted routines, and growing concern over safety and stability, with families following news updates, hoping diplomatic efforts succeed before military confrontation expands. Because history consistently shows that even limited conflict places pressure on healthcare infrastructure, emergency services, and humanitarian resources long before large-scale engagement occurs, prompting international organizations to assess potential risks related to displacement, infrastructure, damage, and civilian protection, while global leaders face mounting pressure from their populations to prevent escalation that could deepen economic hardship at home, illustrating how interconnected the modern world has become, where regional security crises rapidly evolve into global economic challenges. And as policymakers attempt to balance national interests, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic deterrence, the unfolding situation highlights a fundamental reality that peace and stability are not abstract political ideals, but essential conditions supporting economic security, social confidence, and human well-being across nations, leaving observers around the world increasingly aware that the outcome of this confrontation may influence not only regional power dynamics, but also the financial and social stability experienced by millions far removed from the conflict itself. As the world continues watching developments between Iran and Israel, the focus increasingly turns toward what future scenarios may unfold, because history demonstrates that geopolitical crises often reach decisive moments where leadership choices determine whether tensions gradually stabilize through diplomacy or evolve into prolonged confrontation with unpredictable consequences. An analyst now outlines several possible paths, ranging from controlled de-escalation, supported by international mediation, to limited military exchanges designed to restore deterrence without triggering full-scale war. While the most concerning scenario remains the possibility of miscalculation, where rapid retaliation cycles outpace diplomatic communication, creating escalation neither side initially intended, particularly in an era defined by advanced missile systems, cyber warfare capabilities, and instantaneous intelligence assessments that compress decision-making time and increase pressure on national leaders. As global powers continue encouraging restraint while simultaneously reinforcing regional security commitments in order to prevent instability from spreading across neighboring regions already facing complex political challenges. Because any sustained conflict could reshape alliances, influence defense strategies, and economic priorities across the international system for years to come. While citizens around the world observe events with growing awareness that modern conflicts no longer remain distant occurrences, but interconnected crises capable of influencing energy costs, economic stability, travel, security, and global confidence. And despite rising tensions, diplomatic channels remain active, reminding observers that even during periods of confrontation, negotiation often continues quietly behind the scenes, seeking solutions that avoid irreversible outcomes. Yet uncertainty persists as military readiness remains high and strategic messaging continues from all sides, leaving the international community confronting a defining question about whether cooperation can prevail over confrontation in one of the world's most sensitive regions. Because ultimately, the outcome of this crisis will not be decided solely by weapons or power, but by restraint, judgment, and the willingness of leaders to recognize that lasting security depends not only on strength, but on preventing conflict before its consequences extend beyond control. And as the coming days unfold, the world waits, watching carefully, aware that decisions made now may shape regional stability, global markets, and international peace for an entire generation to come.